Totemist. Good evening, dear mortals. I am the totemist. Long ago, I lived countless human lives in my dreams and faced unfathomable horrors. Tonight, I shall share a few of those with you. May you live in peaceful times. The Waves of Crescent Bay. Claire and I had been chasing perfect waves across Australia's southern coast for 2 weeks. We'd met in college in Perth, bonding over shared dreams of surfing every major break in the country. The Airbnb we'd rented stood on a cliff overlooking Crescent Bay, its weathered timber exterior holding decades of salt spray and stories. The waves that first morning were exactly what we'd hoped to find: clean, consistent sets rolling in with mechanical precision, their faces gleaming like liquid glass in the early light. "This is it," Claire said as we waxed our boards on the deck, her voice carrying that reverent tone surfers reserve for perfect conditions. We spent that day in a rhythm as familiar as breathing. Paddle out, wait, catch wave, ride, repeat. The sun was setting when we finally dragged ourselves from the water, our muscles pleasantly exhausted, salt crystallizing in our hair. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly housekeeper who lived in the cottage behind the main house, was tending to her garden as we walked up the path. "Good day out there?" she asked. Her face was a map of laugh lines and sun exposure, hands dark with soil. "Perfect," I replied. "We're heading in to make dinner if you'd like to join us." She accepted with a warmth that felt genuine rather than polite. Over pasta and wine, she told us stories about the area's history, shipwrecks, smugglers, and the changing character of the town as tourism slowly replaced fishing as the primary industry. "What about local legends?" I asked, fascinated by how she brought the past to life with her words. "Any interesting folklore about the area?" Mrs. Peterson's eyes grew distant, as if reading memories written on the horizon, visible through the kitchen window. "Well, there's old stories, of course, Aboriginal tales mostly, passed down so many times, they're probably all mixed up now." She paused, taking a sip of wine. "There's the muljawank, though I haven't thought about that one in years." "What's that?" Claire asked, refilling our glasses. "Water spirit," Mrs. Peterson said. "Lives in the deep parts of the Burry River, though some say it comes to the ocean too. Supposedly, it pulls people under if they swim alone at night." She laughed softly, though that was probably just to keep children from wandering off after dark. The conversation drifted to other topics, but something about the story lodged in my mind like a splinter. That night, I dreamed of dark water and movement just below the surface, of something vast and patient watching from the deep. I woke around midnight to moonlight streaming through the windows and an inexplicable urge to surf. The desire felt foreign yet overwhelming, as if something else's hunger had taken root in my consciousness. The moon was full, turning the world outside into a monochrome photograph, and the sound of waves seemed to carry a melody I'd never noticed before. "Just a quick session," I whispered to myself, though my voice sounded strange in my ears. Claire was asleep in the next room, and I knew I should wake her. We never surfed alone. It was our one unbreakable rule. But something pulled me toward the water with a gravity I couldn't resist. The air was unusually warm for early spring, heavy with moisture that made everything seem slightly out of focus. My wetsuit felt alien as I pulled it on, the neoprene too smooth, too organic against my skin. Each step Down the cliff path seemed both inevitable and wrong, like movements in a dream where you know what's coming but can't change course. Moonlight transformed the familiar break into something mythical. Silver light played across the water's surface, creating patterns that seemed almost like writing in a language too old for human comprehension. The waves were bigger than they had been during the day, their faces black, except where moonlight caught their curves. I paddled out through the water that felt thicker than normal, more resistant to my movement. The usual marine sounds, waves breaking, wind over water, seemed muted, as if something was holding its breath. When I reached the lineup, the spot where we'd spent hours that day, everything felt subtly wrong. The distances were off. The landmarks on shore somehow shifted from their proper positions. The first wave came as if summoned by my thoughts. I turned my board toward shore and paddled, feeling the surge lift me. For a moment, everything was perfect. The glass, smooth face of the wave, the speed, the familiar dance of balance and momentum. Then something brushed against my leg. The touch was deliberate, almost gentle, like fingers testing fabric. I kicked instinctively, but there was nothing solid to kick against. The water around me had become oddly warm and much deeper than it should have been in that spot. Another touch, firmer this time, wrapped around my ankle. I looked down and saw, through water that should have been too dark to see through, something that defied comprehension. It was vast, its form shifting between shapes my mind couldn't quite grasp. It seemed like some sort of cephalopod, its edges blurring into the darkness like ink in water. But its eyes. I remember its eyes with perfect clarity. They were ancient, intelligent, and utterly alien, filled with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. They held me, and in their depths, I saw myself drowning, being transformed into something that no longer knew the touch of sun or the feel of solid ground. Survival instinct took over. I kicked hard, twisting my body in a motion learned from years of wiping out in heavy surf. The grip loosened for just a moment, and I seized the opportunity. I paddled for shore, with strength born of terror, not daring to look back, but feeling something massive moving beneath me, keeping pace with contemptuous ease. A wave caught my board, driving me toward the beach. Behind me, I heard something break the surface. A sound like a whale breaching, but wrong, somehow hollow. Spray hit my back, carrying that unnatural warmth, but I focused only on the shore, on the promise of solid ground and artificial light. I stumbled onto the beach, my board forgotten in the shallows. Behind me, the ocean had gone perfectly still, as if nothing had disturbed its surface. But in the moonlight, I saw something rise one last time, a shape that seemed to bend space around it, that made my eyes hurt to look at directly. Then it sank beneath the waves, leaving only ripples that shouldn't have been moving against the direction of the wind. Claire found me on the deck at dawn, wrapped in every blanket I could find despite the warm night. I tried to tell her what happened, but the words seemed to slip away like water through cupped hands. How do you describe something that exists in the spaces between what we know is real and what we fear might be? She believed me, though. Claire had been surfing long enough to know the ocean holds secrets deeper than any human understanding. We stayed 3 more days in Crescent Bay, surfing perfect waves under the sun where everything made sense. but neither of us went near the water after dark. And sometimes, on full moon nights, I dream of those eyes and wake with an inexplicable urge to go surfing in the dark. But I've learned to resist that siren call. Some waves aren't meant to be ridden. Some depths aren't meant to be plumbed. From the Lagoon. The day started normally enough. We were 5 teenagers with a borrowed tent and more confidence than common sense, determined to prove our independence to parents who probably weren't paying attention anyway. The lagoon sprawled before us like a mirror someone had dropped in the bush, reflecting a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. "This is the spot," Jake announced, dropping his backpack with theatrical finality. His authority came from being the only one of us with a driver's license, though the ancient Toyota that brought us here belonged to his older sister. Sarah immediately started unpacking the tent, her movements precise and practiced from family camping trips. "We should set up before it gets too hot," she said, though the October sun was already baking the red earth beneath our feet. The rest of us fell into our roles like actors in a play we'd rehearsed but never performed. Mia gathered kindling for the fire we'd need later, her dark hair falling across her face as she worked. Tom helped Sarah with the tent, though helped might be generous. Mostly, he held things when she told him to, and tried not to stare too obviously when she stretched to secure the rainfly. I was designated camp photographer, documenting everything with my dad's DSLR. Through the viewfinder, everything looked slightly surreal. The way the eucalyptus trees framed the lagoon, how our tent gradually took shape against the landscape like a geometric intrusion in nature's organic sprawl. The afternoon unfolded with the languid pace of youth, hours stretching like taffy in the Australian heat. We swam in the lagoon, our splashes echoing across the water. Sarah taught us how to skip stones, though none of us could match her record of 7 bounces. Tom tried to catch yabbies with a piece of string and bacon, succeeding only in feeding the local crustacean population. As the sun began its descent, we gathered around the fire pit Mia had constructed. The first stars appeared, hesitant pioneers in the darkening sky. Our conversations drifted like the smoke from our campfire, touching on school drama, future plans, and the peculiar mix of anticipation and dread that comes with being on the cusp of adulthood. "We should tell ghost stories," Tom suggested as true darkness settled around us. The firelight painted our faces in shifting patterns of light and shadow, transforming familiar features into masks that seemed almost theatrical. "I know a good one," Jake said, leaning forward. The flames reflected in his glasses, giving him a momentarily sinister appearance. "My uncle told me about the bunyip that lives in lagoons like this one." Sarah groaned. "Everyone knows about bunyips. They're not even scary." "No, but listen," Jake insisted. "The thing about bunyips is they look different to everyone who sees them. Some people see something like a huge seal with legs. Others see more of a bird thing with tentacles. My uncle swears he saw one that looked like a cross between a crocodile and a human. That's just because the story's been told so many times it's got mixed up," Mia said dismissively, like how every town has their own version of the vanishing hitchhiker. We spent the next hour trying to outdo each other with increasingly elaborate horror stories. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up toward stars that seemed impossibly bright and close. Eventually, exhaustion drew us to our tents, the girls in one, the boys in the other. I was dreaming of dark water when the sound woke me. It wasn't loud, exactly, but it was wrong. A kind of wet, sliding noise that didn't belong in the normal symphony of night sounds. Sarah and Mia were already sitting up, their faces pale smudges in the darkness. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. Before I could answer, we heard voices from the boys' tent, followed by the sound of a zipper. We emerged into a night that felt fundamentally different from the one we'd fallen asleep in. The moon had risen, painting everything in silver light that made the familiar landscape seem alien. The lagoon's surface rippled with small disturbances that couldn't be explained by wind. "Something's out there," Tom said, his voice tight with tension. We all had our phones out, flashlight beams creating intersecting paths of light across the water's surface. The sound came again, closer now, a slithering, squelching noise that made my skin crawl. Something broke the surface of the lagoon, water cascading off a form that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. What happened next exists in 5 different versions, none of which quite align. In my memory, the creature towered over us, its body a strange reptile with too many limbs moving in ways that violated physics. Its eyes glowed with bioluminescence, and its mouth, I still can't think about its mouth without feeling nauseous. But Sarah swears she saw something different, a massive seal-like creature with legs like tree trunks and skin that seemed to shift and flow like liquid darkness. In her version, its eyes were hollow voids that seemed to pull at her consciousness. Jake describes something more insectoid, with segmented limbs and chitinous armor that reflected moonlight like oil on water. Mia's account involves tentacles and a shape that seemed to fold in on itself in geometrically impossible ways. And Tom has never been able to describe what he saw, claiming the memory slides away whenever he tries to focus on it. We ran, of course, fled to Jake's sister's car, without bothering to pack up the tent or any of our supplies. The Toyota's engine roared to life like salvation, and we didn't stop until we reached the outskirts of town, where the streetlights and the first hints of dawn made everything seem almost normal again. Later, when we tried to make sense of what happened, the differences in our accounts created a kind of fracture in our shared reality. We argued for hours, each of us convinced our version was the truth, until we realized that maybe the truth was in the differences themselves. Jake dug deeper into bunyip lore after that night, discovering old accounts that mirrored our experience, multiple witnesses seeing completely different creatures in the same moment. Some suggest it's a quirk of human psychology, our minds struggling to process something that exists outside our understanding of reality. Others propose more esoteric explanations involving quantum superposition and the malleable nature of perception. We never went camping again as a group, though we remained friends through the rest of high school. Something about that night changed us, not in any dramatic way, but in how we understood reality itself. The world felt bigger afterward, more mysterious, as if we'd glimpsed something that existed in the spaces between what we think we know and what actually is. Sometimes, on very quiet nights, I take out the photos from that day. They stop abruptly at sunset. My camera mysteriously failed to work after dark. but in the last image, taken just as the sun was setting. There's something strange about how the lagoon's surface reflects the sky. If you look closely, the ripples don't quite match the direction of the wind visible in the grass. And there, at the edge of the frame, there might be something breaking the water's surface. Sunrise Motor Inn. Memory fractures differently in the Australian outback. Reality becomes fluid in those vast, empty spaces, where the horizon bleeds into sky until you can't distinguish earth from heaven. And each mile mirrors the last in an infinite regression of red earth and gathering shadows. My fuel gauge had been hovering near empty for the past hour, the needle trembling with each bump in the road, like a divining rod seeking salvation in a desert of possibilities. The setting sun painted the clouds in shades of amber and violet, a spectacle that seemed both invitation and warning. I wasn't supposed to be driving at night. The infrastructure inspection in Wilconia could wait until tomorrow afternoon. But something about the emptiness of the landscape had seduced me into thinking I could push further, chase the dying light a little longer. Perhaps it was the same impulse that draws moths to flame, that primitive attraction to our own undoing. Twilight was settling over the land like a bruise when the Sunrise Motor Inn's neon sign pierced the growing darkness. The letters buzzed and flickered, their electric blue glow creating a small island of artificial day in the encroaching night. The parking lot was empty, except for a dusty old car parked behind the office, its windshield reflecting the last traces of daylight like a blind eye. The building itself squatted against the darkness, a single-story relic from an era when these roads saw more traffic, more life. Its architecture spoke of optimism long abandoned, dreams left to bleach in the merciless Australian sun. A bell chimed weakly as I pushed open the office door, disturbing dust motes that danced in the sickly fluorescent lighting like microscopic galaxies. The air inside felt thick, almost gelatinous, carrying the scent of old cigarettes and something else, something organic that lingered beneath the surface like a half-remembered nightmare. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding strange in the empty space, as if the air itself was reluctant to carry the sound. Movement behind the counter drew my attention. The man who emerged from the back room existed in that uncomfortable space between familiar and wrong that makes the mind recoil. His head seemed disproportionately large for his compact frame, perched on narrow shoulders like a balloon on a string. His skin had a ruddy, almost mottled quality that made me think of amphibians, an impression heightened by his wide-set eyes and broad mouth. Each feature individually might have passed for normal, but together they created a composite that set off ancient warning bells in the primitive parts of my brain. "Welcome to Sunrise," he said, his voice surprisingly normal, almost pleasant. The dissonance between his appearance and that ordinary tone made everything feel slightly askew, like a picture hanging just degrees off level. "Just you, tonight?" I nodded, suddenly aware of how alone I was. The nearest town was at least 30 miles in either direction, and my phone hadn't shown a signal bar in hours. The vastness of the outback seemed to press against the windows like a living thing, hungry for whatever light and life existed within these walls. His movements were professionally efficient as he processed my credit card and handed over a key attached to a plastic tag marked Room 7. His fingers were short and thick, with something odd about their proportions that I couldn't quite place. Air conditioning's working, he said, but the unit's a bit noisy. Hope that won't be a problem. Something in his expression made me wonder if I'd imagined a note of amusement in his voice, like someone sharing a private joke that only they understood. Should be fine, I replied, though the words felt hollow in my mouth. Room 7 existed in a liminal space between past and present, a time capsule of faded carpeting and furniture that had seen better decades. It smelled of industrial cleaner and something else, something organic that lurked beneath the chemical scent like a secret trying to surface. The air conditioner rattled to life with a sound like grinding bones, pumping cool air that did little to dispel my unease. A small bookshelf beside the bed held a random assortment of paperbacks left behind by previous guests, their spines cracked and faded like archaeological artifacts. One book caught my eye, Aboriginal Legends of the Outback. Its pages were yellowed with age and desert air, carrying that particular scent that old books acquire, like time itself had been pressed between their pages. I settled onto the bed, letting the air conditioner's drone fade into white noise as I flipped through the pages. Each story seemed to whisper of things that lurked in the spaces between civilization, creatures that remembered when humans were not the dominant species in this vast land. A chapter heading made me pause. The Yara-ma-yha-who. The illustration showed a small, red-skinned creature with an oversized head and large mouth, its proportions unsettlingly familiar. According to the text, it was said to lurk near water sources, waiting for unwary travelers. My eyes skimmed the description. A creature that would swallow its victims whole, only to regurgitate them later, changed. Each subsequent transformation would make the victim more like the creature itself, until they too became Yara-ma-yha-who. The air conditioner's rattle seemed to take on a different quality as I read, like something trying to speak through mechanical noise. Each clank and groan began to sound deliberate, almost linguistic, as if the machine was trying to communicate some urgent message in a language just beyond my comprehension. Sleep became impossible with the cacophony, each metallic shriek setting my nerves further on edge. The darkness pressed against the windows like black wool, thick and suffocating. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. The digital clock's red numbers showed 2:17 a.m. as I pulled on my shoes, each digit seeming to pulse with its own inner light. The office was dark, except for a small lamp behind the counter, its glow creating more shadows than illumination. No one responded to my knock, but the door was unlocked. The bell chimed again as I entered, its cheerful tone incongruous in the midnight silence, like laughter at a funeral. "Hello?" I called again, softer this time. The empty counter seemed to mock my presence, its surface reflecting the weak light like still water. A door marked private stood ajar behind the counter. Light spilled through the crack, accompanied by wet, rhythmic sounds that made my skin crawl. Something primitive in my hindbrain screamed danger, but my body moved forward and as if pulled by invisible strings drawn toward that light. The door opened silently under my hand. The scene before me existed in a realm beyond normal reality, like a Bosch painting rendered in fluorescent light and shadow. The hotel manager knelt on the floor, his oversized head bent over something that had once been human. His movements were methodical, almost peaceful, like a child enjoying an ice cream cone on a hot day. The fluorescent light cast multiple shadows behind him, each one moving slightly out of sync with his actions. My foot brushed against the doorframe, a whisper of contact that seemed to echo like thunder in my ears. But he didn't turn. I backed away, my movements controlled by instinct rather than conscious thought. The bell remained mercifully silent as I slipped out of the office, though I could have sworn I heard something like laughter coming from behind that partially open door. The night air hit my face like a slap. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition, every shadow suddenly alive with threat. The engine's roar seemed impossibly loud in the desert silence, a mechanical scream that surely must have carried for miles across the empty land. As I pulled onto the highway, my headlights swept across the office window. For a moment, I thought I saw him standing there, watching my departure with those wide-set eyes. His broad mouth might have been smiling, or maybe that was just a trick of light and shadow and fear-addled imagination. In that brief illumination, his skin seemed to pulse with its own inner light. I drove through the night, pushing my car well past the fuel gauge's empty warning. The darkness ahead seemed alive, writhing with possibilities I refused to contemplate. The sun was rising by the time I reached Wilcannia, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. I gave my report to the Pipeline Infrastructure Committee via video call, citing car trouble for my disheveled appearance. My voice sounded strange in my ears, as if the night's events had somehow changed its fundamental frequency. Later, when I looked up the Sunrise Motor Inn online, I found nothing. No reviews, no listings, not even a marker on Google Maps. Just an empty stretch of highway where my memories insisted a building should be. I spent hours scanning satellite images, looking for any trace of that lonely building and its strange custodian, but found only the endless red earth of the outback, unbroken by any sign of human habitation. Sometimes, on long drives through empty places, I think about that night, about the wet sounds from behind that door, and about all the people who must pass through such places and never leave, about how many cars might be slowly collecting dust behind rural motels, their owners transformed into something unrecognizable by forces that lurk in the spaces between civilized places. I wonder about the stories we tell ourselves about progress and civilization, and how thin that veneer really is when confronted with things that remember when humans were not the apex predators we imagine ourselves to be.